What would you do if a dead man trusted you more than his own family? Cry. Refuse. I signed the paper, and 3 days later, the most dangerous man in the city was standing on my porch, telling me I now belonged to him too. My name is Ruth Bellamy, and for 6 years I lived in the small yellow house at 14, Maple Court, right next door to the biggest mystery on the block. Everyone on Maple Court had a theory about the Whitfields. Eleanor Whitfield was 71, silver-haired, and impossibly elegant, the kind of woman who wore pearls to water her roses. Her husband, Charles Whitfield, was rarely seen. When he moved through the neighborhood like weather, quiet, heavy, and impossible to ignore. Black cars idled outside their gate at strange hours. Men in dark suits nodded at Eleanor and never looked twice at anyone else. The other neighbors whispered that Charles Whitfield's money didn't come from the import business listed on his tax returns. I never asked. I just brought Eleanor tomatoes from my garden every Sunday, and she gave me tea and terrible advice about men, and somewhere in those 6 years, she became the closest thing to family I had left. I was 34, a size 18, and invisible in every room that mattered. I worked as a claims adjuster, drove a 12-year-old Honda, and had been quietly, humiliatingly single since my last relationship ended with a man named Peter telling me, almost gently, that he needed to marry someone who photographed well for his firm's holiday card. I had made peace with being the woman who brought vegetables to her elderly neighbor and went home alone. I did not expect that peace to matter to anyone. I certainly did not expect it to matter to Charles Whitfield. He died on a Tuesday in March, quietly, in his sleep, the way violent men rarely do. The funeral was enormous and terrifying, a cathedral full of expensive black suits and faces that did not know how to grieve because they had spent their whole lives learning how to threaten. Eleanor sat in the front pew like a queen carved from ice, and I sat near the back where I belonged, in a navy dress I'd owned for 4 years, watching men who looked like they'd stepped out of a federal indictment file weep for a man they called, in low voices, the old man and the boss. The will was read 4 days later, in a law office on the 40th floor of a glass tower downtown. I only knew about it because Eleanor had called me the night before, her voice papery and strange. "Ruth, dear, you need to be there tomorrow. 10 o'clock. Please don't ask me why." I sat in the back of that room too, in the same navy dress, wedged between Eleanor's stepson Damon Whitfield and his wife Vanessa, who looked at me the way people look at gum on a shoe. Damon was 40, gym-sculpted, and radiating the specific hunger of a man who has spent his entire adult life waiting for his father to die. Vanessa wore white in March, at a will reading, which told you everything about her that you needed to know. The lawyer, a gray, precise man named Mr. Okafor, read through the assets first. The house on Maple Court to Eleanor, absolute. The shipping company's legitimate holdings to Damon, with conditions. Trusts, accounts, numbers so large they stopped sounding like money and started sounding like weather systems. Damon's leg bounced under the table, hungry and impatient, waiting for the number with his name attached to grow larger. Then Mr. Okafor turned a page, cleared his throat, and said something that made the entire room go still. There is a final provision, personal in nature. Mr. Whitfield requested that a Ms. Ruth Bellamy, residing at 14, Maple Court, be formally named as a designated companion and weekly welfare check for Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, with full access, discretionary authority in matters of her care, and a standing monthly stipend for her time. Mr. Whitfield further requested that this arrangement be protected under the estate, and that Ms. Bellamy be granted the same physical security detail as Mrs. Whitfield, effective immediately. For a moment, I genuinely thought I had misheard my own name. Every head in that glass-walled conference room turned toward me at once, and I felt my face burn the particular deep, humiliating red that only happens when you are the only ordinary person in a room full of people who matter. "Excuse me," Damon said, his voice sharp enough to cut. "Who is Ruth Bellamy?" "She waters my tomatoes," I said, before I could stop myself, and somebody near the window actually laughed. Vanessa's mouth curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. I'm sorry, is this a joke? My father-in-law left security detail and a stipend to the neighbor? The neighbor who looks like she shops exclusively at the clearance rack? Eleanor, tell me this is a joke. It is not a joke, Eleanor said quietly, and there was steel under the quiet. She's clearly angling for something, Damon said, standing, jabbing a finger toward me like I was a stain he intended to have removed. Look at her. She's been sniffing around this family for years, probably hoping my father would leave her a check she could retire on. It's pathetic. That is enough. The voice came from the doorway, and it did what Lorenzo Moretti's voice had done in every story I'd ever heard about men like him. It emptied the room of air. I turned, and standing there, filling the doorway the way a held breath fills a chest, was a man I recognized from the funeral, the one who had stood closest to the casket and touched nobody, spoken to nobody, and made 3 armed men flinch simply by shifting his weight. He was somewhere near 40, dressed in black that had clearly never seen a department store, with dark hair silvering slightly at the temples and eyes the color of wet slate. He did not look angry. He looked like a man who had already decided the outcome of the conversation and was simply waiting for the room to catch up. Gabriel, Eleanor breathed, something like relief flooding her face. Mrs. Whitfield, he said, inclining his head to her with genuine warmth, before his eyes cut back to Damon, and the warmth vanished like a light switched off. You were saying something about Miss Bellamy. Damon's bravado wilted visibly. Gabriel Castellano, this doesn't concern you. This is a family matter. Your father made it my matter, Gabriel said, walking into the room with the unhurried, contained menace of a man who had never once in his life needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. I ran his security for 18 years. I read every provision of that will before it was filed, because he asked me to. I know exactly why Ruth Bellamy's name is in that document, and it has nothing to do with money, and everything to do with the fact that you have called your father's widow twice since the funeral, both times to ask about liquidity, while this woman has brought her groceries every week for 6 years and asked for nothing. He stopped directly in front of me, close enough that I had to tip my head back to hold his gaze, and something in his expression shifted, sharpened, focused entirely on me in a way that made my pulse stutter. Charles trusted very few people in his life. He trusted you enough to put your name in a legal document that I am personally responsible for enforcing. That makes you someone I intend to take very seriously. Does anyone in this room have a problem with that? Nobody did. Vanessa's white dress suddenly looked less like a statement and more like a mistake. Damon sat back down so fast his chair skidded. Good, Gabriel said. He turned to Mr. Okafor. Draw up the security clearance for Ms. Bellamy today. I'll personally handle the detail assignment. Then, to me, quietly, in a voice meant only for me, come outside with me for a moment. I think you deserve an explanation, and this room doesn't deserve to watch you get one. We stood on the 40th floor terrace, the city spread out below us like a circuit board, and Gabriel Castellano told me things I had never wanted to know and could not stop wanting to hear. Charles Whitfield had not made his fortune purely in shipping. He had run something older, darker, and far more organized than import taxes, a network that controlled ports up and down the eastern seaboard, and Gabriel had been his head of security since he was 22 years old. He was not a good man in the way the world measures good men, Gabriel said, leaning against the railing, watching me instead of the skyline. But he loved his wife with a devotion that terrified people twice his size, and in his last year, he became obsessed with the idea that when he died, the vultures circling this family would pick her apart. Damon has been quietly moving money out of joint accounts for 8 months. Vanessa has already spoken to 3 estate attorneys about contesting Eleanor's competency. Charles knew. He told me, 3 weeks before he died, that the only person he trusted to actually notice if something was wrong with Eleanor, who wasn't already circling the money, was the woman next door who brought her tomatoes. I'm not anyone special, I said, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. I'm not the kind of woman men like you notice. Something dark and unreadable moved through his expression. Men like me, he repeated slowly, spend their entire lives surrounded by people who are beautiful and hollow, and calculating exactly what they can extract from a room. You walked into that conference room in a 4-year-old dress and got humiliated in front of 40 lawyers, and the only thing on your mind was embarrassment, not leverage. Do you have any idea how rare that is? Charles saw it. I'm only sorry it took his death for me to see it too. The weeks that followed were the strangest of my life. A black car began appearing outside my house every morning, driven by a quiet, watchful woman named Petra, who Gabriel had personally assigned to me. My modest little house on Maple Court suddenly had a security system that could have protected a bank vault. And Gabriel himself came by twice a week, ostensibly to review the security detail with me. Though our conversations stretched from 20 minutes into 2 hours, sitting on my porch steps while I learned that the most feared enforcer on the eastern seaboard took his coffee black, hated cilantro, and had read more novels than anyone I had ever met. You're staring, I told him one evening, self-conscious under the porch light, aware in the way I always was of exactly how much space my body took up on the step beside him. I am, he agreed, without a flicker of apology. You have a habit of tucking your hair behind your ear when you're about to say something honest. I like watching for it. I'm not the kind of woman men stare at, Gabriel. His jaw tightened, the way it did right before his voice dropped into that low, dangerous register I had learned to associate with people about to regret whatever they'd just said. Somebody convinced you that your body is a liability instead of a fact, he said quietly. I don't know his name, but I know there was one. There's always one, and I would very much like the opportunity to explain to him, personally, exactly how wrong he was. He reached over, tucked that same strand of hair behind my ear himself, his fingers unhurried against my skin. You are not a woman men fail to notice, Ruth. You are a woman most men are too small to deserve. It was 3 weeks later, on a warm Sunday afternoon, that everything came apart. I had gone to Eleanor's for our usual tea, and found her sitting at her kitchen table with a stack of bank statements in front of her and an expression I had never seen on her face before, fear. Damon came by this morning, she said, her hands trembling around her teacup. He had papers. Guardianship papers, Ruth. He's filing a petition claiming I'm not competent to manage my own affairs. He had a doctor's letter. I've never even met this doctor. I called Gabriel before I'd finished reading the first page. He arrived in 11 minutes, and Petra arrived with him, along with a woman I didn't recognize who turned out to be a forensic accountant Gabriel kept on retainer specifically for situations exactly like this one. It took the accountant less than 2 hours to find what Damon had been hiding for 8 months, a shell account in the Caymans, quietly fed by transfers skimmed from 3 of Charles Whitfield's legitimate shipping subsidiaries, all of it dressed up as consulting fees paid to a company that, on closer inspection, existed only on paper and was owned by Vanessa's brother. He's been robbing his own father's estate to fund a guardianship petition against his stepmother, the accountant said flatly, sliding the printout across Eleanor's kitchen table so that when the petition succeeds, he controls every dollar he hasn't already stolen. Gabriel read the report once, in complete silence, and then looked up at me with an expression that made the hair on my arms stand up. Ruth, he said, very calmly, I need you to trust me for the next few hours, and I need you to stay exactly where Petra tells you to stay. The guardianship hearing had been scheduled for the following Friday, in a modest county courtroom, and Damon arrived looking pressed and confident, flanked by a lawyer with a smile like a shark's. Eleanor sat beside her own attorney, pale but composed, with me directly behind her. What Damon did not expect was for the courtroom doors to open 20 minutes into the proceedings and admit Gabriel Castellano, dressed in a charcoal suit, carrying a slim leather folder, followed by 2 federal agents whose badges caught the fluorescent light. Your Honor, Gabriel said, addressing the judge with the same unhurried authority he brought to every room he entered. Before this court rules on Mrs. Whitfield's competency, I believe it needs to see evidence relevant to the petitioner's motive. He handed the folder to the bailiff. This documents 8 months of embezzlement from the Whitfield shipping subsidiaries, totaling just under $3 million, funneled through a shell company controlled by the petitioner's brother-in-law and used, among other things, to retain the very physician whose competency letter forms the sole basis of this petition. Damon's lawyer was on his feet immediately, objecting, but the judge was already scanning the documents, her expression hardening with every page. Damon's face went the color of old paper. "This is fabricated," he said, too loud, his composure cracking down the middle. "She put you up to this, didn't she? The neighbor, the nobody you've been parading around. This is her doing, isn't it? What is she even doing here? This has nothing to do with." "She has everything to do with it," Gabriel said, and the temperature in the courtroom seemed to drop 10 degrees. He crossed to stand beside my chair, one hand resting on the back of it, not touching me, but close enough that everyone in the room understood exactly what the gesture meant. "Ruth Bellamy has spent 6 years showing your stepmother more genuine care than you have shown her in 20. She was named in your father's will because he trusted her judgment more than yours, and every single thing that has happened in the last 3 weeks has proven he was right too. If you have a problem with her presence in this courtroom, you can address it to me." One of the federal agents stepped forward. "Mr. Whitfield, we're going to need you to come with us. We have some questions about wire transfers to the Caymans." They led Damon out in handcuffs while Vanessa sat frozen in the gallery, her white dress this time looking exactly as guilty as it should have. The guardianship petition was dismissed within the hour. Eleanor cried, quietly and with relief, and gripped my hand so hard it left marks. It was that evening, back on my porch, that Gabriel finally set down the coffee I'd handed him and simply looked at me for a long moment, the porch light catching the gray in his eyes. "Charles put your name in that will because he saw something in you that most of the city is too shallow to see," he said. "I've spent 3 weeks pretending my visits were about security details, and I think we both know that stopped being true after the first week." He reached out, his hand settling warm and certain against the curve of my waist, the first time he had ever touched me like he had every intention of not letting go. "I don't do things halfway, Ruth. I never have. So I'm not going to pretend this is casual or convenient or anything less than exactly what it is. I want you. Not despite the space you take up in a room, but because of it. Tell me you feel even a fraction of what I feel, and I will spend the rest of my life proving that every man who ever made you feel small was catastrophically, permanently wrong." I did not tuck my hair behind my ear. I did not look away. I kissed him instead, on my own porch, in the last gold light of the evening, and felt, for the first time in my entire life, entirely and unapologetically seen. Eleanor still gets her tomatoes every Sunday. Vanessa moved out of state before her brother's sentencing hearing. And I never did go back to being the invisible woman in the navy dress at the back of the room, because Gabriel Castellano made very sure, in every room we have walked into since, that nobody in it ever forgets my name again. What did you think? Was Charles Whitfield's final wish the smartest move he ever made? Or did Gabriel steal the show completely? If you loved watching Ruth go from invisible to unstoppable, smash that like button and share this video with someone who needs the reminder that they were never the one who was too much. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more slow burn revenge romance every week. Tell me in the comments, would you have trusted the will or run the other way?